Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to your very own BYJU'S 6th, 7th, and 8th grade channel. I'm your teacher for the day, Aishwarya, and I welcome you to yet another amazing class with us, where in this video we are going to be discussing the chapter Reproduction in Plants, and we will do a chapter summary for this in under 30 minutes. Now, if you are looking for an entire chapter explanation and you want a detailed chapter explanation, check on the link in the description given below. I will be giving you the link for the one shot. So you can watch this video where I have covered all these concepts in great detail. So students, I hope you have your textbooks and your notebooks ready, and without wasting any more time, we will get started with this particular chapter. Now, as you can see, this particular chapter on reproduction is very important because as you go to grade 8th or when you go to grade 10th, this concept of reproduction will keep following, which is why knowing this chapter at your level in grade 7 is very, very important. Now, what do we understand by this word reproduction? So let's break it down. We have re and production. If I break it, that means I am constantly producing something. So in this case, reproduction can be defined as the process wherein living organisms, right? All living organisms, they have the ability to make a young one or a young baby of their own kind. And this young one or this young baby that they produce is what is called as an offspring, or we call it as a young one as well. These are two terms that I use interchangeably, and it is produced from an adult whose name or who we call as a parent. So if you look at all living organisms around you, whether you look at a cat or a dog or an elephant or a lion or a tiger, you take any animal, right? We all know that all of them can produce a young one. And this young one or this baby or this offspring that is there can keep growing and will become into a adult version of that organism. So if we have a dog will give birth or give rise to puppies, right? Cute little puppies. And each of these puppies can grow and become into a mature dog. And in turn, they can produce more puppies. So what do you understand by this? We see that they are constantly producing, right? Now, why is reproduction essential? Why are we talking about this particular process? Because you see, reproduction is extremely important for the survival, right? See, every living organism has a definite lifespan. That means that they have a definite time from which they are alive, from birth to death. That means it is the period that they are alive, which we call as a lifespan. Now, every living organism has a set lifespan. Now, if you look at dogs or if you look at human beings, as a matter of fact, 200 years ago, you find human beings. But that same human may not be alive at this point because the lifespan of a human being is roughly between 70 to 80 years, right? I'm taking an average. Now, in such cases, how is it that human beings are still existing on the planet? Because they are making young ones, they are making babies that will continue their species. So reproduction is essential for the continuity of an organism or survival of an organism generation after generation. Now we see that reproduction can happen in one in two ways depending upon the adult or the parent. So based on this, we see that there are two modes of reproduction, where we have asexual mode of reproduction and we have sexual mode of reproduction. Now in asexual mode of reproduction, we see that there is only one organism or one parent involved. While in sexual reproduction, we see that there are two parents which are involved in the process. So we see that there is a male and there is a female involved in this particular process. Now moving on, if you see, we see that especially in sexual reproduction, because a male and female is involved, we see that they will produce some special structures. So when I say they are the ones getting involved, how do they get involved? They produce some special structures or some special cells, and we call them as reproductive cells. We can call them as sex cells, or another name for them is gametes, right? Now, why are they so special? So as you see, they are the reproductive cells. So when I say they are the ones which get involved in reproduction, when I say male and female is involved in reproduction, it means that these reproductive cells are the ones getting involved in the process. While on the other hand, in asexual mode of reproduction, we see that there are no such gametes produced or involved. Now in asexual mode, one more thing we observe is that there is one parent, right? This one parent will undergo certain changes and it will give rise to two daughter offspring. So you can say that it gives rise to two young ones. Now because there's only one parent and within its body it is undergoing some changes, we see that these offsprings or these young ones who are there, they are identical to the parent. Why? Only one is there that is undergoing changes, giving rise to this. While on the other hand, because in sexual reproduction, what do we see? In sexual reproduction, we see that there is a male and a female, right? And they are producing some reproductive cells. And these reproductive cells that are there are the ones coming together, combining, fusing, and then giving rise to the young one. So we see that it will have some characteristics from the father or the male and some from the mother, which is why here it will not be identical, but it will be similar. Yes, so now I hope you are clear with the idea of what is reproduction and what are the two modes of reproduction. Now I know you don't have it so much in detail, but I've gone a little bit in detail for all of you so that when you are summarizing the chapter, you are strong conceptually as well, right? So now let's move on to the different modes of asexual mode of reproduction that we see in, that is discussed in this particular chapter. Now the first one is very briefly mentioned, right? And that is fission. So what is fission? Fission is, or rather I would say binary fission to be more precise, right? So binary fission is something that we see in organisms like amoeba, wherein we see that they don't have a definite shape or size and there is only one parent amoeba involved. Now this parent amoeba will undergo various changes within itself and it will split. It will not split into half, but rather it will split in such a way that it will give rise to two offsprings. So this process right here where a parent cell will split and give rise to two daughter cells, we call this process as binary fission. And this again is identical to the parent. Now next up we have budding. Now budding is something we see in organisms like yeast, right? Now if you look at yeast, yeast is a fungi. And in the case of budding, if you see, in let's say like in yeast, we see that there is a small outgrowth. That means that when I say outgrowth, that means it is growing outside the body, not inside the body. So as you can see, there will be a small outgrowth. And this outgrowth that is there will keep undergoing development and eventually what will happen? It will grow, it will develop, it will mature and it will become into a new, almost a new daughter organism or a new cell, right? Now, two things can happen. This bud will either detach from the parent or it will remain attached and it will keep growing further and further, forming a chain of buds. So the mode of reproduction wherein organisms reproduce by producing buds or outgrowth is what we will call as budding, seen in organisms like yeast and even in hydra. Now next up we have fragmentation. Now in the case of fragmentation, we see it in organisms like Spirogyra. Now what is Spirogyra? Spirogyra is a algae. It is a multicellular algae and it is filamentous, right? So what will happen is once let's say the Spirogyra has become a parent, we see that this Spirogyra parent will split. Its body will split into fragments, right? It will split into fragments and we see that each fragment, remember this, each fragment here will give rise to a new organism. So this process is what we call as fragmentation. Now we have spore formation. Now spore formation is seen both in organisms like fungi and even in some plants. So we see it in some plants like ferns. Now in fungi what happens is that they are mainly made up of various thread-like structures. Okay, fungi are made up of various thread-like structures called as hyphae. Yes, so these thread-like structures that you see, the thread-like structures that you see here are the hyphae. Now we see that in some cases, some thread-like structures will go upwards. So it will stand. And then they end up having these balloon-like structures. Now these balloon-like structures that you see is called as a sporangium. So it's like a balloon, right? Now inside the balloon, there'll be small powdery substances. Now these powdery substances or small substances you see inside is what we call as spores. Now once the sporangium matures, we see that this sporangium will break, right? And when it breaks, all these spores will get released. So normally if you see, one common example that I can give you is that of bread mold. So you've seen that when there is stale bread or old bread, you would observe these grayish patches, right? You will observe these grayish patches on the bread. Now that is because they are, and eventually it will keep growing in size, right? That patch will become bigger and bigger. Why does that happen? That happens because with the help of spores. So when spores fall, they'll fall in and around the surroundings. Now think of these spores like seeds. When they get the ideal conditions to grow, they will germinate into a new organism or a new fungi. But like I said, conditions need to be ideal. So here we know that they require a warm and they require a moist condition in order to germinate. If the conditions are not favorable, then they will not do anything. They will not die, but they will remain inert or inactive. So when it is not favorable, it is going to remain inactive, but it is not going to die. So this point is very important for all of you to remember. Now the next one that we have here is in the case of, let's say, ferns, right? Spore formation in ferns. So in ferns, what do we see? On the underside, right? Same logic, just that on the underside of the leaves, you will find these yellowish structures, right? So you'll find these yellowish structures which are called as the sporangium, inside which we will find the spores. Now again, when the spores are released, they'll fall on the ground and eventually they will give rise to a new plant. So spore formation is seen in plants like ferns as well as in organisms like fungi. Yes, so these are two examples for us to remember. Now next up we have vegetative propagation. Now vegetative propagation is something that we see in plants, right? And we're talking about higher order plants. Now broadly, if you look at the structure of the plant, we can categorize the different parts into two categories. We have the sexual part and the vegetative parts. The root, the stem and the leaf come under the category of vegetative parts of the plant. Why? Because all these parts have specific functions to carry out. So whether it is the root that is responsible for absorbing water, whether it is the stem that helps in transport of substances, or the leaf that helps us in producing food, we see that they all have specific functions to do, and they are not directly involved in reproduction. So they have no role in reproduction. While on the other hand, if you look at the sexual parts which are the flower and the fruit, right? Their job is mainly to help, and their only job is to help with reproduction, which is why we call them as sexual parts, or we will call them as reproductive parts of the plant. So in such cases, when the vegetative parts, right? So when the vegetative parts help in the process of reproduction, we call it as vegetative propagation. And in different plants, we see that we are able to propagate them using either the root, the stem, or the leaf. So in the case of sweet potato, we use the root of the plant, right? And we know that there are these specific structures that are present on the roots that help in propagating or growing a new plant. Similarly, in the case of stem, we have our normal potato. So we know that potato is actually a modified stem. And we see that in this particular case, they have these eyes on them from which the buds grow. Yes, and these buds are the ones which will eventually give rise to a new plant. And in the case of bryophyllum, we use the leaf of the plant in order to grow them. So on the leaf margins, we have these leaf notches from which the new young ones arise. So these are the examples that you will have to remember, and understanding the mechanism is also very important on an examination point of view. So this sums up our entire understanding about asexual mode of reproduction. We have all the different types along with the examples. Now let's move on to sexual mode of reproduction in plants, right? So in sexual mode of reproduction, we see that it is something where we observe it in flowering plants. Now quickly to recall, in sexual mode of reproduction, two parents are involved, a male reproductive part, female reproductive part, and they produce specialized cells for reproduction which we call as gametes. Yes. So in flowering plants, if you see the reproductive organ, right? The reproductive organ is nothing but the flower. Now if we look at the structure, so let me just go back. So if we were to look at the structure of the flower, we see that initially the flower starts developing as a small flower bud, right? We see that it develops as a small flower bud. And this flower bud is protected by leaf-like structures called as sepals. Now sepals are responsible for protecting the flower bud, and they are also responsible because they are leafy and green-like. They also help with photosynthesis. Next up, we know that when you look at a flower, we look at the most colorful part of the flower. So the colorful part of the flower is nothing but the petals that help in attracting insects and various other organisms. Now along with this, next up we have the male and female reproductive part. The male reproductive part is called as the stamen, and the female reproductive part is called as the pistil. So because the flowers contain the reproductive parts, we call it as the reproductive organ. Now, if we were to individually look at the structure of the stamen, right? So if you were to look at the structure of the stamen, we see that the stamen is made up of a bilobed structure, or has a bilobed part called as the anther. And inside the anther, we find various sac-like structures called as pollen sacs, inside which wherein we find the fine powdery substance called as pollen grains. So these are fine powdery substances called as pollen grain, and inside the pollen grain we find the male gamete, which is very important for the reproduction process. Now the anther is supported by this filament, and both anther and filament together make up the stamen. Now next up we have the pistil, right? So if we were to look at the structure of the pistil, so let me just roughly draw this. So if we were to look at the structure of the pistil has this top knob-like structure called as stigma, followed by which it kind of looks like a glass vase, right, or a flower vase. So here we see that it has this long tube-like part called as style, a swollen base which is called as the ovary, inside which we find many ovoid structures called as ovules. And inside the ovules we find the female gamete. Now for reproduction to happen, understand that this male gamete and this female gamete here need to come together and fuse. So now we see that next step is to make sure that the male and female gametes, they come together, right? So how do they come together? They come together with the help of a process called as pollination. So pollination is nothing but the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. Now there are two kinds of pollination, where we have self-pollination that can happen, where the transfer of pollen can happen between anther to stigma of the same flower, or it can happen between anther to stigma of two different flowers but in the same plant. While cross-pollination, on the other hand, happens between two different flowers of two different plants but of the same kind. Yes, cannot be like there is one rose and one hibiscus. No, but it could be two different hibiscus plants, or two different rose plants, or anything that undergoes cross-pollination. I'm just giving you a hypothetical example. So we see that for cross-pollination to happen, insects, wind, in some cases water, we see that birds, they're all involved, or they act as agents that help in transferring the pollen from one place to another. Now, of course, once pollination has happened, the male and female gametes would come closer. So now the pollen grain has landed on the surface of the stigma. So it has been transferred to the stigma. Now from here it will start to grow, forming a pollen tube. It will go down through the style and reach the ovule. Now once it reaches the ovule, the male and female gamete will come together and they will fuse, right? So we see that they will come together and they will fuse, forming a single cell structure called as zygote. And this zygote will undergo series of developments. Now, once this fusion has happened, right, we see that the ovary will ripen and it will become the fruit, while the ovule will become the seed. And inside the seed, if you were to look at a seed, right, inside it we will find the embryo or the young one, which will eventually, once the seed germinates, it will grow into a new plant. While what about the other parts of the flower? Now, once fertilization has happened, the sepal, petal, stamen, stigma, style, everything will fall off. And all that will be left are the ovary and ovule that will develop into the following structures as we have seen here. So with this, everybody, we've come to an end-to-end understanding of how development takes place, right? Or how a young one is produced in a flower. Now, one more topic that we need to cover is seed dispersal. Now, seed dispersal is a mechanism that is seen in plants where they disperse or they spread out their seeds in various ways, so that we can see that the seeds are spread out, they have ample amount of space to grow, and there is limited competition, right? So they can be spread out through various ways. It can be through wind, through water, or through animals. Now, in order to be dispersed by wind, we see that there are these seeds which have these certain characteristics. So some seeds have wings in them, right, like in the case of maple seeds, while some of them are very lightweight so that they can easily be transported, like in the case of cumin seeds, and some have very hairy seeds as well, like in the case of dandelions. While those which are normally dispersed by water, like in the case of coconut, we see that they have a very lightweight seed so that they can easily be carried by water, while some have these spiny seeds, right? So in the case of xanthium, these are all some examples wherein, because they have these spines on them, they can be transported by animals, where the spines will help in attaching them to the surface of the animals, right, or on the surface of the body, and then they get transported further away from the parent plant. So with the students, if you see, we have